Part 39. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 381. 3 hours later. In their district. A man and a woman walk down the street together. The man looks to be in his 20s, very young, wearing a white t-shirt and blue jeans, a very ordinary outfit. The man is handsome. Although not exaggeratedly handsome, he is still attractive. That woman looked like a little loli, about 12 or 13 years old. But she looks very cute. She was wearing a pink lace strapless one-piece dress with an ultra-short hem. Her long and slender legs were wrapped in white stockings, and she wore a pair of pink high-heeled boots. Her long red hair was tied into twin tails. She has a delicate face, big ruby-like eyes, a high bridge of nose and thin lips. This little loli is like a fairy tale princess walking out of a painting. The existence of this little loli attracted the attention of people around her. People passing by could not help but look at the little loli. Look, it's so cute. Well, just like a doll, no, much cuter than a doll. Are her eyes wearing contact lenses? They are so cute. She has great skin and looks so cute. I feel like I pinched her face. The people next to him stopped, looked directly at the little loli, and kept talking. Most of the people who want to pinch little loli's faces are girls who are out for a walk. These two people are naturally Chen Tao and Betty. Chen Tao listened to the discussion next to him and felt the eyes coming from the side. He subconsciously looked at Betty beside him. Betty held Chen Tao's hand. Her small hand could only hold 3 of Chen Tao's fingers. She looked around with her big eyes, seeming to be quite interested in the situation in the Tal district. Betty didn't feel the slightest bit about the sights and comments next to her. However, it's normal. No matter how you say it, Betty is also the king of the Red Dragon. As a king, she has never seen any scene. Of course, she doesn't care about other people's eyes. Betty suddenly stopped. Noticing Betty's actions, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He looked at Betty and found that Betty was looking straight in one direction. Chen Tao looked along that direction. Betty can be seen staring directly at a sign. The sign says, Lin's Western Restaurant. The most important thing is that there are various patterns on this sign, including the pattern of steak. Seeing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but blinked. He looked at Betty and said with a smile, "Want to try the steak here?" Betty's eyes lit up slightly. She looked at Chen Tao with a smile on her face, "Yes." Seeing Betty's cheerful look, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, "Let's go, this girl is really obsessed with steak. It's been so long, and she still hasn't gotten tired of it." Betty held Chen Tao's 3 fingers with her little hand. Chen Tao closed his hands and wrapped her small palm in his palm. Her hands were small and soft, as if they could be broken with a snap of her fingers, giving Chen Tao a feeling of weakness. Chen Tao held Betty's hand and entered the Western restaurant. As soon as she entered the Western restaurant, a waitress in uniform came over. When she walked over, she looked directly at Betty, as if she couldn't move away. When she got closer, the waitress's gaze falling on Chen Tao, she said, "Sir, may I ask you to?" Chen Tao nodded slightly. The waitress said, "Then please come with me." Following, the waitress leads the way. Chen Tao and Betty followed. The two of them walked to a seat and received a signal from the waitress. Chen Tao sat down on the chair. Betty sat opposite Chen Tao. The waitress took out her notebook and pen, looked at the two of them, and said, "What do you two want?" Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "Bring me 2 steaks. I want the best steak from you, medium rare, with black pepper sauce." The waitress nodded slightly, she wrote with a pen, then turned and left. Chen Tao watched the waitress leave. He looked away and looked at Betty in front of him. Betty was wearing a thin pink strapless dress. From Chen Tao's angle, you could see her touching collarbone and round shoulders. She has a small body, and wears a pair of delicate pink high-heeled boots on her legs wrapped in white stockings. Very cute. Betty noticed Chen Tao's gaze and looked at Chen Tao. There was a hint of shyness in her eyes. She gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes and said, "You haven't been honest all morning, and now you are still staring at people with such a penetrating look. You are really a Lolita control, a big pervert woolen cloth." Chen Tao blinked, touched the back of his head, and said with an embarrassed smile, It should be fine. You are my baby, and I am interested in you. I think it should be okay." Betty's face blushed slightly. "That's nice to say, baby. As soon as you see me, you think of those weird things in your head, and you know how to bully others." Chen Tao was so happy that he couldn't help but smile and said, "Do you know why when I saw you, I was thinking about those weird things?" Betty blushed slightly, gave Chen Tao a blank look, and turned her face slightly away from Chen Tao. The smart Betty had heard Chen Tao's sweet words before. Now hearing what Chen Tao said, Betty naturally knew what Chen Tao wanted to say. Therefore, Betty didn't talk to him. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed. He smiled and said, "Baby, will it be better to sit next to me?" Betty was startled. She looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao opened his hands and motioned Betty to sit in his arms. Betty blushed. She rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "No way." The other side. When Betty and Chen Tao came in, other guests in the restaurant had already noticed this side. After all, Betty's cuteness was too attractive. Betty attracted people's attention, and those people's eyes naturally noticed the interaction between Chen Tao and Betty. That lowly, she looks only 13 or 14 years old. Not his sister, nor his cousin, but his woman. No way. She's only 13 or 14 years old. Is this okay? It's disgusting. This is a lowly control. The one who said disgusting was a man, and he said it, looking at Chen Tao with anger. That is jealous anger. Some people think in their hearts, but because they can't get it, they can only do this. Chen Tao also heard the discussion next to him, but he didn't care at all. Chen Tao never thought he was a Lolita control. After all, the girl in front of him looked young, but her actual age was probably older than the ages of all the people on Earth. If this was a Lolita, the people on Earth would probably still be in their mother's womb. "Brother, this is not good." Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao raised his head and looked at the voice next to him. There was a man, about 1.9 meters tall, wearing a black vest, revealing his strong muscles. He looked at Chen Tao with a hint of displeasure in his eyes. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 382. Chen Tao looked at the man. Yes, it was normal that Chen Tao and a little girl who looked about 13 or 14 years old were so intimate in public, and people would not be able to bear it. Chen Tao took back the time and focused on Betty. At this time, a waiter came over with a dining cart. Betty's eyes were attracted by the dining cart. The dining cart stopped, and the waiter brought the steak on the dining cart to the table, and Betty's eyes lit up slightly. Betty's attention had been attracted by the steak, and she seemed to be less interested in what was happening here. Chen Tao retracted his gaze. He looked at the big man and said, "Is there any problem?" The big man frowned and said, "What's the problem? Don't you look at yourself? In this restaurant, kissing a 13 or 14-year-old girl, do you know shame?" He looked at Chen Tao and said, Daquan, can't stand this kind of thing." Daquan crossed his arms, stared at Chen Tao, and said lightly, "You let this lowly go immediately, and swear not to look for her again, otherwise, don't think about leaving here today." Hearing this, Chen Tao blinked and smiled. "Did you misunderstand something?" Daquan frowned. "What misunderstanding?" At this time, Chen Tao smelled a warm aroma coming from the front. He looked at Betty, who stood quietly, watching the black pepper sauce pouring on the steak and smelling the aroma. Betty's little face was full of satisfaction and joy. She couldn't wait to pick up the knife and fork to taste the steak, and the trouble-making Daquan next to her was directly ignored. Betty didn't seem to care about the troublemaker next to her. Seeing this, Chen Tao looked at Daquan and said, "Well, if I don't want to do what you say, what are you going to do?" Daquan's breathing stagnated slightly, and his face darkened. "Do you want to die?" He slapped the table with his big hand. This slap on the table. Betty's hand holding the knife and fork paused slightly, and she frowned slightly. Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at Daquan, and said with a smile, "It's been a long time since anyone said such a thing to me. Do you want to die?" "Well, it's very interesting." Daquan frowned, and he stretched out his big hand and held Chen Tao's collar. Daquan pressed Chen Tao on the chair, stared at Chen Tao, and said, "I hate lowly control like you the most. Let her go honestly and swear not to touch her in the future, otherwise I will beat you to pieces today." Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He smiled, looked at Daquan, and said, "Really? You can give it a try." Daquan's pupils condensed slightly, he bit his teeth, and clenched his fists. "Sir, please don't fight in our store." The waitress next to him changed her face when she saw it. Daquan was startled, and he looked at the waitress. The waitress frowned and said, "If you fight, I will call the police." Although the waitress didn't think much of Chen Tao and Betty's relationship, fighting in this restaurant would not work if she didn't stop it. The waitress said, "The Tal district is not the Tal district of the past. Please don't make things difficult for us." Daquan frowned, and he raised his fist towards Chen Tao's face. After hesitating for a while, he slowly put it down. Looking at Daquan's actions, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. "Let go of my collar." Daquan's face was gloomy. He looked at his hand holding Chen Tao's collar, and he had to slowly let go of his hand. Chen Tao sat down slowly, straightened his collar, looked at Daquan, and said with a smile, "You have a strong sense of justice, but unfortunately, you are managing the wrong person." When Daquan heard this, he stared at Chen Tao. "Managing the wrong person, humph, indeed, now is a society ruled by law. But don't think that I will just let this matter go." Daquan took out his cell phone, looked at Chen Tao and said, "Now I see you eating in this restaurant, it's very annoying. You'd better leave here immediately, or I will call the police, and wait for the people organized by Hong Tao to come. I want to see how you explain it." Chen Tao looked at Daquan, he crossed his arms, looked at Daquan and smiled, "Whatever." Daquan's pupils condensed slightly, and he snorted, "Okay, very good." He dialed the phone, put it to his ear, and stared at Chen Tao. "Hello, is this someone from Hong Tao's organization?" Daquan stared at Chen Tao and continued, "There's a Lolita lover here, at Lin's restaurant." "Yes, please send someone over right away." Chen Tao listened to Daquan's voice, shook his head helplessly, then looked at the waitress next to him and said, "Where's my steak?" When the waitress heard it, she said, "Here it is." Just now, Chen Tao and Daquan were talking, which made the waitress a little excited, so she didn't bring the steak up. Now that Chen Tao said this, the waitress brought the steak from the dining car to the table. She opened the lid, and a faint aroma came to her. It was the smell of steak. The waitress took the black pepper sauce and poured it on the steak. With the sound of sizzling, a fragrance came to her. This familiar smell made Chen Tao's appetite increase greatly. Chen Tao slowly picked up the knife and fork, cut a piece of steak by himself, and put it into his mouth to taste it. He looked at Betty. Betty had already started eating, and she had eaten 1/5 of the steak. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled. Someone nearby was looking for trouble, but Betty didn't react at all and just focused on eating. It was obvious that food was the most important thing to her. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Is it delicious?" Betty hummed, "It's much worse than our Katie's steak, but it's okay." After all, Katie's steak is not always available while speaking. She put the beef into her mouth, chewed it, closed her eyes, and looked satisfied. She didn't hide her satisfaction with the delicious food at all. Looking at Betty's cute expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, "My side is more delicious, do you want to try it?" "Is it more delicious?" Betty's eyes lit up slightly. While speaking, she hadn't swallowed the beef in her mouth yet, and her words were a little fuzzy, although the fuzzy lowly voice was very nice. Chen Tao smiled, "Of course it's delicious, come, I'll feed you, open your mouth." As he said, he cut a piece of beef with a fork and sent it to Betty. Betty opened her little mouth and ate a piece. She chewed gently, hummed, looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes, and said with a smile, "It's delicious." Seeing this, De Quan frowned tightly. These two people actually ignored him directly. De Quan felt his face getting hot. He looked at Betty and said, "Little sister, if you want to eat steak, I can treat you." When Betty heard this, she looked at De Quan. De Quan looked at Betty and said, "This man is not a good person. I will treat you to steak and then take you home, okay?" When Betty heard this, she frowned and said, "Are you an idiot? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 383. De Quan was stunned. He came to save this little Lolita, but this little Lolita actually called him an idiot. Although the little Lolita puffed up her face and called people idiots, the Lolita's scolding was very cute, but De Quan felt strangely uncomfortable. You know, he wanted to save this little Lolita. Betty looked at De Quan and said, "I'm having dinner with my man, what does it have to do with you? It's inexplicable." De Quan was stunned. He looked around and found that the people eating next to him were looking at this side. Being taught a lesson by a little Lolita, and then feeling the sights of those around him, De Quan suddenly felt his face hot. He looked at Betty and said, "You said, he is your man." Betty said, "Well, is it strange? He is not only my man, we have a child now." Everyone in the restaurant was stunned. The waitress on the side was pushing the dining cart away. When she heard Betty's words, she paused and stared at Betty. Her mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were full of disbelief. "The child, is there?" Chen Tao suddenly felt countless eyes on him. Those eyes showed astonishment, envy, jealousy, and anger. Anger seemed to be the majority. Chen Tao subconsciously touched the back of his head and looked at Betty, who was sitting opposite him. Betty was small, like a doll, and looked very cute. If anyone came to see her, they would probably think she was only 13 or 14 years old. As a result, Betty said that Chen Tao and she had a child. The people around were of course shocked. But here, only Chen Tao knew Betty's real age. "I thought this guy was just playing around, but I didn't expect that he really did it. Beast. Beast." People in the restaurant were whispering. Chen Tao felt like someone had labeled him as a beast on his back. Chen Tao's mouth twitched. De Quan looked at Chen Tao, his eyes full of anger, and said, "You, this beast." De Quan stretched out his big hand and once again grasped Chen Tao's collar. This rude action made Chen Tao frown slightly. He raised his head and looked at De Quan. De Quan clenched his fist, and he clenched his fist and was about to punch Chen Tao in the face. "Stop." Suddenly, a voice sounded. Hearing this voice, De Quan paused. Everyone looked in one direction. At the door, a woman in uniform walked in from outside, followed by a strong man in uniform, who was looking at the side with his hands on his chest. It was organized by Hong Tao. Hearing the Hongtao organization, Daquan hurriedly let go of Chen Tao's collar. He looked at the two Hongtao members and said, "You came at the right time. I called the police. This one here is a Lolita control." As he said, he pointed at Chen Tao. When the woman heard it, her time fell on Chen Tao, and she looked at the little loli sitting opposite Chen Tao, and she frowned slightly. She walked up to Chen Tao and said, "I am Law Enforcement Officer Zhou Ying. Please show me your ID." Chen Tao looked at Daquan, who was standing beside him. Daquan was looking angry and staring at Chen Tao. He looked as if he wanted to punch Chen Tao in the face. However, Daquan was lucky. After all, he didn't hit Chen Tao. Chen Tao reached out of his trouser pocket and took out an ID card and handed it to Zhou Ying. Zhou Ying took it, took a look, and then looked at Daquan and said, "What happened here?" Daquan looked at Chen Tao with disgust in his eyes and said, "This man brought this girl here." As soon as they came in, the two of them were extremely close. And just now, this girl told me in person that she was pregnant with this man's child. Zhou Ying's face changed slightly, and her face sank slightly. She looked at Chen Tao with a hint of anger in her eyes. The onlookers next to them looked at the side with a look of watching a good show, and most of them looked at it with an attitude of the bad guys get punished. Zhou Ying looked at Chen Tao and said, "Mr. Chen, right? According to our Hongtao rules, having sex with an underage woman is against our Hongtao rules. Please go back with us and accept the investigation." Chen Tao looked at Zhou Ying and said, "You asked me for an ID, so why didn't you ask her for one too?" Zhou Ying was startled and frowned. "What do you mean?" Chen Tao raised his hand and there was another ID in his hand. He handed the ID to Zhou Ying and said, "This is her ID." Zhou Ying was slightly startled, and she stretched out her hand and took it. One look. Zhou Ying's pupils condensed slightly, and she looked at Betty next to her in disbelief. Zhou Ying's companion Wu Tanglai noticed Zhou Ying's expression and said, "What's wrong?" The people who were watching this side also showed curious eyes. Only Betty was on the field, eating steak slowly, as if the things next to her had nothing to do with her. "Look for yourself." Zhou Ying handed Betty's ID to Wu Tanglai. Wu Tanglai took it and looked at the ID card. It was Betty's, but the date of birth registered on it made Wu Tanglai stunned. Wu Tanglai took out his mobile phone and took a photo of the ID card. "What's wrong?" Daquan was also stunned. He said, "He made such a little girl have a child, why don't you arrest him?" "Little girl?" Wu Tanglai looked at Daquan and said, "She is 19 years old. According to the regulations, she is an adult and cannot be considered a little girl." Daquan was stunned. "Huh? 19? Look at her like this, she doesn't look 19. Is this identity certificate fake? 19. Daquan looked at Betty, at the small, delicate, and cute little loli in front of him. This 19 years old? No matter what Daquan thought, he couldn't understand that this could be a 19-year-old woman. Chen Tao asked Lin Na to prepare that identity certificate for Betty. Of course, Chen Tao would not let Lin Na get Betty's true date of birth, otherwise, this group of people would probably be scared to death. 19 is considered just fine. Zhou Ying crossed her arms and looked at Betty next to her. She said, "If it's true or false, we'll find out after checking." "Check it out." Daquan looked at Wu Tanglai and saw that Wu Tanglai took a photo of the ID card and then operated it. Seeing this, he felt relieved and looked at Betty. "Yes, how could this be 19 years old? This identification must be fake. Betty is very cute, just like a doll, petite and cute. Her skin is as delicate as that of a newborn baby. With such a delicate figure and such a small figure, no matter how possible, she does not look like she is 19 years old." Daquan said, "It must be fake." Wu Tanglai looked at Zhou Ying and said, "This is true." Daquan felt as if he was struck by lightning. With a bang, he couldn't help but look at Betty. Is it true? Zhou Ying hummed. She took the ID card from Wu Tanglai, put the two cards together, handed them to Chen Tao, and said, "That's no problem. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 384. Is it true? No way, that girl is 19 years old. She looks like a doll, how can she be 19 years old? It's true, right? The people in Hong Tao's organization said it was true, so it can't be fake. That is to say, this is a legal loli. The discussion beside him sounded. Listening to the discussion beside him, Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly. He was too lazy to think about it. He took the knife and fork and cut the steak in front of him, putting the beef with juice into his mouth. With a light bite, the juice splashed. Although the taste was not as delicious as that of Katie's carefully fried, it was a rare opportunity to step on the land of Earth after such a long time and taste the food here. It felt quite interesting. "Little sister, are you really 19 years old?" a voice came from the side. It was Zhou Ying's voice. Chen Tao looked at Zhou Ying, and saw that Zhou Ying pulled a chair and sat down. She looked at Betty with a questioning look in her eyes. Betty put a piece of beef into her mouth, she chewed it, then looked at Zhou Ying and said, "My age? I also forgot how old I am, but I think I should be older than your grandmother." Zhou Ying was startled, and the corners of her mouth twitched. A delicate little loli said such words in a unique loli voice. Although the words were not very good, but with this delicate loli voice, even if the words she used were not good, people who heard it would not be angry. On the contrary, they would think Betty was very cute. This is the charm of her lowly body. Zhou Ying closed her eyes, touched the back of her head, and looked helpless. She stood up and said, "Since the identity certificate is real, let's do it." Zhou Ying said, "Team up." With that, she turned and left with her people. The identification will not be wrong. Although the little Lolita in front of her looks cute, there are always special people. Girls who look like little girls but are already adults, although rare. Zhou Ying has seen them before. Zhou Ying left with her people. Chen Tao retracted his gaze and looked at Betty. Betty was enjoying the steak in the Dixing Western restaurant by herself. She pursed her thin lips, savored it carefully, and then closed her eyes, showing a look of enjoyment. She seemed to be very happy. Looking at Betty's expression, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile, and he said, "Come." He forked a piece of beef with a fork and brought it to Betty's thin lips. Betty was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao with her ruby-like eyes and slightly opened her thin lips. She had a small mouth. When she opened her mouth, her thin lips slightly opened, revealing her white teeth inside. She gently took a bite of the beef. Looking at her small action, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. He looked at Betty, and his eyes were shining. "So cute." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Is it delicious?" Betty hummed, "Delicious." Chen Tao got up and came to Betty under Betty's gaze. He stretched out his hand and picked Betty up. He sat on the chair by himself, and then put the petite Betty in his arms. Betty sat down in Chen Tao's arms, and she raised her little face to look at Chen Tao. Chen Tao gently hugged Betty's waist, and he looked at Betty. The four eyes met. Chen Tao smiled and said, "I'll feed you." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "No need, I can cut steak myself now." Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Then let's cut it together, so you can have 2 servings. Betty's eyes lit up slightly. She was naturally happy to realize that she could eat more steak. But Betty looked indifferent and said, "It's up to you." She used her small hands to hold the knife and fork and cut the steak by herself. Chen Tao also held the knife and fork and shared a steak with Betty. While cutting the steak, Chen Tao looked at Betty in his arms. Betty's body was small. She sat in Chen Tao's arms with her upper body sitting straight. She was seriously cutting the beef by herself. Because of her petiteness, she did not affect Chen Tao at all when he was cutting the steak. The distance was a bit close. Chen Tao could clearly smell the faint fragrance on Betty's body, and his eyes could not help but fall on Betty. Betty was wearing a pink off-shoulder dress. From this angle, Chen Tao could see her knife-like collarbone and round shoulders. Her fiery red long hair was tied into two ponytails, revealing her white neck. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he slowly approached Betty's neck and smelled her hair fragrance. Betty's face flushed with two blushes, and she said, "Don't make trouble." Chen Tao smiled, "It smells so good. Compared with steak, I think you are more delicious." Humph! Betty's face turned even redder, and she hummed softly. Hearing Betty's hum, Chen Tao smiled. Betty took a bite on her own. Chen Tao watched Betty's actions and watched her chewing the food. Her eyelashes trembled slightly, her cheeks bulged slightly, and she looked very cute. Chen Tao said gently, "Is it delicious?" Betty was slightly startled and nodded slightly, "Well, it's not bad. I'll try it." Chen Tao looked at her profile and said gently. After hearing this, Betty said, "Then you can eat it yourself, don't you have it over there?" She looked at the steak on the opposite side. The steak was only eaten by Chen Tao twice, and now the steak was left there as if it was neglected. Chen Tao said, "As for me, I prefer to eat yours." Betty subconsciously turned her face to look at Chen Tao. Chen Tao pinched her small chin and lifted her face. Their eyes met. Chen Tao lowered his head. Betty's eyelashes trembled slightly. "What are you doing? So many people are watching." She closed her eyes. In the restaurant, those who watched this scene widened their eyes. "Really, kissed? Well, that doll, actually with that man." De Quan next to him was even more stunned. This scene was too eye-catching. Chen Tao separated Betty. Betty's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her ruby-like eyes, with a hint of confusion in her eyes. Chen Tao smiled, "It's really delicious." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao, retracted her gaze, and stopped looking at Chen Tao. This man was so excessive every time, just knowing how to bully her. She couldn't adjust her messy emotions, so she could only bury her head and continue cutting steak. "Excuse me." Suddenly, a voice came from the side. Chen Tao looked back and found De Quan touching the back of his head, standing there with an embarrassed look on his face. Chen Tao looked at the man, his eyebrows slightly stretched, and said, "What did you say?" De Quan looked embarrassed and said, I didn't know about this, I misunderstood you, and called you a Lolita control." He looked at Chen Tao and said awkwardly, "I apologize to you for this matter. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 385. Apologize. Chen Tao blinked and looked at the big man in the black vest. He smiled and said, "Interesting, you are quite reasonable." This guy ran out to teach Chen Tao a lesson. Now that he knows that he has misunderstood, he apologizes. If it were someone else, he would have felt ashamed and ran away. Should I say that he is thick-skinned, or what? Chen Tao looked at De Quan, who was embarrassed and didn't look thick-skinned. De Quan smiled bitterly and said, "I apologize for my behavior just now." Chen Tao retracted his gaze and said, "It's okay, I don't care about your evaluation." De Quan was startled. He looked at Chen Tao and found that Chen Tao was teasing Betty and didn't look at him at all. De Quan looked at Chen Tao with a smile on his face. Seeing that Chen Tao really didn't care about him, the corner of his mouth twitched, he touched his hair, turned around and left. He was embarrassed, very embarrassed. Chen Tao looked at Betty in his arms, and he smiled, "After eating steak, do you want to go somewhere to play?" He gently hugged Betty. Betty pursed her lips and said, "I don't know, what about you? Where do you want to take me?" She turned her head and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Betty, he smiled and said, "As for me, I want to take you home and do something I love." Betty's fair face blushed slightly. "I know, you don't think about good things all day long, you are so bad." Chen Tao smiled, "Who makes you so cute?" Hearing this, Betty blushed and snorted softly, "Don't think that if you coax me like this, I will let you bully me obediently. Then, after eating steak today, you will accompany me back, okay?" Chen Tao asked with a soft smile. Betty was startled, she rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "I told you, don't think that if you coax me like this, I will let you bully me obediently, no way." "Then do you want to go back?" Chen Tao put down the knife and fork in his hand, slowly hugged Betty's petite body, he looked at Betty's small profile, with a smile in his eyes. "I said, I won't go back." Betty puffed her cheeks, she was a little angry. What's wrong with this man? Bullying her? Chen Tao looked at Betty, he gently whispered in Betty's ear, "But, I thought about it, what should I do?" "You think, that's your business. What does it have to do with me?" Betty blushed, and the ruby-like eyes under her eyelashes trembled slightly. Chen Tao said, "Okay." Chen Tao was a little disappointed and said, "There is no way, then I can only find the future Betty to replace it." Betty was startled when she heard it, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "You dare?" She puffed her cheeks and looked angry. Chen Tao looked at Betty's reaction and said with a smile, "What does it matter? She is you, and I am the same as you." "No way." Betty was angry, she puffed her cheeks and said, "Anyway, I don't care, you want me. I don't want you to give that kind of feeling to other people, whether it is me in other timelines or other people." Hearing this, Chen Tao was a little helpless and said, "But, in this case, aren't you going too far? You don't give it to me, and you don't let me touch others. Let me endure it, is this a punishment?" Betty's face flushed slightly, and she retracted her gaze without looking at Chen Tao. Then wait until I finish eating, and I will accompany you home." Speaking of this, her face became even redder. Chen Tao smiled, "So good." When Betty heard this, she puffed up her cheeks, turned around and rolled her eyes at Chen Tao, saying, "Bad guy, big bad guy." Chen Tao smiled, and couldn't help but get close to Betty, kissed her cheek, and said with a smile, "So cute." Betty stopped talking and ate by herself. She had no way to deal with this man. When she was angry, the words she said in that lowly voice were inexplicably interesting to Chen Tao. And this man didn't respect her at all and always tried to bully her. But Betty found that she had no ability to resist. She had no way to deal with Chen Tao. Although she had no way, she was not angry, but happy in her heart. Too contradictory. But Betty could only indulge in this contradiction and couldn't extricate herself for a long time. After eating the steak, Chen Tao took Betty back to the bedroom. As soon as he arrived in the bedroom, Chen Tao picked up Betty and sent her to the bed. Betty looked at Chen Tao with a red face. Looking at Chen Tao's face, Betty has always been the king of red dragons. Seeing others is like a beast seeing its prey. But in front of Chen Tao, Betty feels more like a little lamb, while Chen Tao is still a hungry wolf. Betty looked at Chen Tao's face getting closer and closer, her eyelashes trembling slightly, pursed her thin lips, and said softly, "Be careful, child." Chen Tao smiled, "Well." Betty slowly closed her eyes. 3 hours later. After taking a bath, Chen Tao, wearing a bathrobe, sat at the head of the bed and looked at the scenery outside the window. It is now night, and a starry sky can be seen outside the window, with twinkling stars and bright moonlight. In the high sky of base number 1, the moonlight is very huge. Chen Tao looked at these pictures, he retracted his gaze and looked at Betty beside him. Betty was sleeping soundly with her eyes closed, her cheeks were red, and the corners of her mouth were slightly raised, revealing satisfaction. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand and gently stroked her messy hair, then he looked away and looked at the scenery outside the window. Betty is very tired, so I won't disturb her. With nothing to do, Chen Tao raised his hand and opened a screen. Through that picture, Chen Tao could see what the sanctuary looked like. When Chen Tao took a look, there was a hint of novelty in his eyes. There was originally a huge wall outside the sanctuary. The wall did not have any doors. If you wanted to get out of the wall, you could only hang down from the top of the wall using a lifting platform. But now when Chen Tao looked at it, he found that there was an extra door on the north and south sides of the sanctuary. The door was 5 meters high and 2 meters wide, which was very large. So as soon as Chen Tao opened the screen and looked at the entire sanctuary, he saw the 2 doors at a glance. Seeing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he smiled. It seems that Pei Ai and the others have already begun to change the sanctuary. These 2 gates of the Holy Land are symbols of the changes in the Holy Land. This door is probably a bit difficult to open based on the previous mechas of the sanctuary. It is obvious that this is the door opened by the people of the sanctuary using the mecha left by Chen Tao for Pei Ai. Interesting. Chen Tao waved his hand and the scene changed. Pei Ai's figure appeared on the screen. Seeing Pei Ai in front of him, Chen Tao's eyes lit up slightly. Pei Ai is actually in the bathroom, taking a shower? In the bathroom, Pei Ai stood under the shower head, while the warm water fell on her body, and white mist filled the air. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, maybe he could consider accompanying Pei Ai. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 386. Last night, Leslie, the commander of the sanctuary, died, and overnight, the sanctuary completely changed. Dimanche became the new commander of the sanctuary, and under Dimanche's command, Pei Ai followed and Qing, who became the new leader of the resource group, to handle the chores in the sanctuary. For example, open 2 doors on the other side of the wall or something. The strangest thing about Pei Ai is that Pei Ai thought that when Taimanza ran for the Holy Land commander, she would encounter Jenna's obstruction. After all, Jenna had always been the resource group's sworn enemy. But today, Jenna not only did not stop them, but also gave them convenience in every way. Very strange. Pei Ai closed his eyes and thought about what happened today while taking a bath. After taking a bath, Pei Ai wrapped herself in a bath towel and left the bathroom. Coming out of the bathroom, she sat in front of the dressing table and picked up a hairdryer to dry her hair. Pei Ai closed her eyes and thought about what happened today little by little. The night slowly became quiet, and in this quiet night, people's thoughts relaxed. Pei Ai closed his eyes. As soon as he closed his eyes, a face suddenly came to mind. It's the man's face. There were 2 blushes on Pei Ai's cheeks under the corners of his eyes. I've gotten tired of being by his side these past few days, and even sleep in his arms. Isn't it okay without him by your side now? Thinking of this, Pei Ai's face heated up slightly. Thinking of what Chen Tao did. Pei Ai's face turned red and he said, "What am I thinking? Wouldn't it be nice for him to leave for a while? If he is around, with his temperament, he always likes to do weird things. It's just so bad." Pei Ai closed her eyes. Thinking about the things Chen Tao would do when he was by her side. Pei Ai's face was as red as a cloud and he closed his eyes. Those things she didn't dare to think about when she was alone before, but in front of the experienced Chen Tao, all those things she didn't dare to think about were done with Chen Tao's help. Don't think about it anymore. Pei Ai planned to have a good sleep to drive away his fatigue. Suddenly, Pei Ai felt the bed move. Pei Ai's eyelashes trembled slightly. Someone is approaching. Who could it be? When Pei Ai thought about it, She understood. It's him. Only he could quietly come in from outside her room, and only she had the courage. You must know that Pai is a warrior in the sanctuary. No one except him has the courage to sneak into her room in the middle of the night. Pai closed her eyes and didn't think about anything. But at this moment, the man behind him leaned over, and Pai fell into a strong embrace. A big hand fell on her waist. Pai felt the familiar body temperature and breath behind her, and her face turned slightly red. It's been a day, where have you been? Chen Tao smiled. He touched Pai's arm and comforted her. He looked at Pai and smiled softly and said, "Miss me?" Pai said, "Well, it's okay, I didn't think so." In other words, she still thought about it. Chen Tao looked at Pai in front of him. Pai was wrapped in a bath towel and turned his back to Chen Tao. The bath towel fit Pai's figure, and her waist was full. The bath towel was very short, and her legs were slender and straight. She had just washed her hair and Chen Tao could smell her hair. Chen Tao approached Pai's cheek and kissed him. He smiled and said, "This is a reward for missing me." 2 wisps of red clouds flew up on Pai's face. She pursed her thin lips, closed her eyes and said nothing. Chen Tao hugged Pai, felt her body temperature, and said softly, "How are you today? Are you very busy?" Pai said, "Well, the laws of the sanctuary need to be changed, and then the environment also needs to be changed. I used the mecha you gave me to open 2 gates on the wall. This way people can go out, you know." When they went out, their faces were filled with joy and they looked very happy. Pai Xiao said, "I was in the mecha and looked at their smiling faces, especially the children's glowing eyes and moving smiles. They looked particularly beautiful." Upon hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Pai. Pai had her eyes closed. As she spoke, she seemed to recall the scene she saw today, and there was a smile on her face. Chen Tao smiled, "Your smile is also very beautiful." Pai pursed her thin lips, as if she wanted to suppress her inner emotions, but the corners of her mouth still rose involuntarily. "There's just something strange about it," Pai said softly. Chen Tao blinked and said with a smile, "Where?" Pai raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. She looked at Chen Tao with moving eyes and said, "Zhen Na, it's strange. Today at the high-level meeting of the Holy Land, Dimanche ran for the interim commander. At that time, I thought Zhen Na will come out to stop it, but it's strange. She's been causing trouble for us all day." Chen Tao blinked and smiled, "It's not surprising. Isn't it strange?" Pai turned around slightly and faced Chen Tao face to face. He looked at Chen Tao and said, "You don't know, Jenna is our mortal enemy. She dislikes Dimanche very much. She has always loved Dimanche. How can it not be surprising that the leader is against him?" Chen Tao said with a smile, "I think the reason why unpleasant things happened to you in the past was because of the influence of the laws of the sanctuary, right?" Pai blinked and thought for a moment. Her eyebrows stretched slightly and she looked at Chen Tao and said, "Well, that's true. She enforces the law too coldly and has no humanity, so she often conflicts with the group leader." Pai looked at Chen Tao and said, "Does this have anything to do with it?" Chen Tao looked at Pai, he smiled and put his arm around her slender waist. "Of course it does matter. Now that the laws of the sanctuary have changed, there will be no conflict between you. Her law enforcement is a little colder. That's because of the sanctuary? The law is so cruel, it will be better now that it has changed." Chen Tao raised his hand, lifted up a few strands of hair that were sticking to her cheek, and put them behind her ears. He looked at the face so close in front of him. The eyelashes are long and narrow, and the eyes are big, as clear as lake water. A high nose bridge and pink thin lips. In addition, she had just taken a shower, looking lazy and secluded, which made her look particularly pleasant. Looking at the cute face in front of me, I hugged her. Chen Tao could feel her body temperature and smell her fragrance. Chen Tao's eyes fell on her thin lips, he slowly lowered his face and kissed her. Parted lips. Pei Ai's eyelashes had a hint of moisture, her face turned red and she hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao said with a smile, "Originally, we are not allowed to do this according to the laws of the sanctuary, but, I want to challenge what is not allowed again." Pei Ai blushed in Chen Tao's arms and said softly, "Now the laws of the sanctuary are going to be revised, so it was not allowed before, but it is allowed now. It shouldn't be a challenge." Chen Tao smiled, then. He held Pei Ai's little hand and said, "Let me ask you, are you willing to give birth to a child for me?" He looked at Pei Ai with a smile, and Pei Ai's face was deeply hidden in Chen Tao's arms. She said, "I have reached this age, and you are my man. If you want to, of course I agree. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 387. Pei Ai is different from Betty. Betty is small and petite, just like a doll. Of course, unlike the doll, she is soft and fragrant. Pei Ai is a mature woman with a tall figure. It can be said that everyone has his own thing. Around 4 in the morning. Chen Tao, who didn't need any rest, was lying on the bed, looking at the ceiling. Sleeping and eating are just a habit for Chen Tao, and it doesn't matter if he doesn't sleep. Chen Tao now feels full of energy and not tired at all, and it is already 4 o'clock in the morning. Chen Tao looked at the ceiling, then turned sideways and looked at Pei Ai beside him. Pei Ai closed her eyes and looked tired. Her long hair was naturally draped on the bed behind her, looking a little messy. She fell asleep, sleeping soundly. Chen Tao smiled, slowly approached Pei Ai, and kissed her cheek tenderly. Her cheeks were soft. Chen Tao's eyes moved and fell on the wrist of Pei Ai's little hand. On Pei Ai's wrist, you can see the passing time. Chen Tao slightly picked up Pei Ai's little hand and looked at the time on her wrist. There are light green Arabic numerals written on Pei Ai's wrist. She has more than 20 years left. More than 20 years? Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and he looked at Pei Ai. Pei Ai has to be genetically modified, at least so that she doesn't have to worry about wasting time. With the thought coming together, Chen Tao didn't hesitate much. Time stops passing. The surrounding world turns into a blue code world. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Pei Ai, and Pei Ai's entire body turned into blue code mode. Chen Tao said, "Xingyun, upgrade Pei Ai's genes and upgrade her to a second-generation genetic body. In this civilization, there is no need to use 2 advanced genes. The second generation of genes is enough for Pei Ai to control the planet." Instructions received, upgrading is in progress. It was Nebula's voice. Chen Tao could see that the code on Pei Ai was changing. It didn't take long. Upgrade completed. Nebula's mechanical voice sounded. Hear this sound. Time resumes its passage. Chen Tao looked at Pei Ai's wrist again and could see that the time on her wrist had turned into the infinity symbol representing infinity. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Pei Ai, who was still sleeping. Chen Tao looked away, carefully put down Pei Ai's hand, and got out of bed. The figure disappeared from the spot and he left. 2 hours later. Sunlight filtered in from the window and fell on the bed. On the big bed, Pei Ai frowned subconsciously, her eyebrows relaxed slightly, and she opened her eyes. The bed in front of her was empty. The man who looked like a hungry wolf yesterday was no longer here. Pei Ai raised his hand and landed on the place where Chen Tao was lying before, feeling the coolness in his hand. It's obvious that Chen Tao has been gone for a while. Pei Ai couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. She hoped that Chen Tao could spend more time with her. If she could see Chen Tao sleeping next to her in the morning, she would be happier. But Pei Ai was not a child. After comforting himself for a while, Pei Ai got out of bed and washed up. Holding a toothbrush, brushing teeth. Suddenly, Pei looked in the mirror. She held the toothbrush in her mouth and looked at her wrist. The time on her wrist turned into an infinity symbol. What is this? Pei's eyes were filled with confusion, and she frowned slightly. Time, where is my time? She touched the symbol with her hand, and it was still the same as before, no difference. Infinity. Pei blinked and said, is it endless time? Is this impossible? She pursed her thin lips, thought for a moment, and said, is it Chen Tao? Realizing this, Pei raised his hand and held the toothbrush. While brushing, he looked at the mirror and looked at the symbols on his wrist through the mirror. Her heart warmed slightly. Although Chen Tao left, he still left a gift for himself. Although she didn't know what the symbol represented, it was a very happy thing for her to receive a gift from her beloved man. Don't think about it anymore. Pei went out. Back to work. Sister Pei, something happened. Now almost all the residents of the lower class areas have gone outside. Most of the people who came out went outside to search for food or something. Pei's current mission is to patrol outside the sanctuary to ensure the safety of the residents. A little girl ran over and held Pei's hand. Her face was full of nervousness and anxiety. There are monsters, there are monsters. Pei was slightly startled. Monster, she frowned. Impossible. This was Pei's first reaction. It is impossible for Chen Tao to lie to Pei. All the monsters in this world must have been eliminated. How could there be monsters now? But Pei knew this little girl. She was the child of a resident of the lower class district, named Xiaoqin. Pei thought it was impossible for the monster to appear, but looked at Xiaoqin's panic. Pei said, take me to see it. Xiaoqin hummed, and she trotted with Pei in one direction. Pei hurriedly followed. Right there, Xiaoqin pointed over there with her little finger. Pei looked forward and found that it was a forest. It has been many years since humans left the Holy Land. The trees outside the Holy Land have grown tall and can be seen everywhere. And there is a forest in front of us. Ah! As soon as Pei approached, she heard a sound from the forest. Pei stopped and did not bother to ask those people what they were doing in the forest. She looked at Xiaoqin next to her and said, wait for me here, I'll go over and take a look. Xiaoqin's eyes were filled with tears and panic, and she said, save them. Pei nodded. Pei walked in. Monster, there can't be a monster. But what's with that sound just now? Pei was puzzled and trotted to the source of the sound. Suddenly, a black shadow jumped out of the bushes beside Pei. It rushed towards Pei, who was unprepared. Pei turned her head and her pupils condensed slightly. Suddenly, she was knocked to the ground by the creature that suddenly pounced on her. The bloody mouth bit directly on Pei's throat. Pei hurriedly put her hands in front of her to block the monster's bite. Pei saw the monster clearly. This is not a monster at all, it is a wolf. It is gray all over, it is a gray wolf. The gray wolf stared at Pei fiercely. It was skinny and obviously had not eaten for a long time. It approached Pei madly, and it completely regarded Pei as food. Pei's face was as pale as paper. Pei believed that there were no monsters in this world anymore, because she did not use mecha at the beginning, and she never thought that the current situation would occur. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 388. What should I do if I don't have a mecha? While resisting the wolf's attack, Pei's body also reacted. He quickly pulled out the dagger from his waist and put it into the wolf's belly. Ouch! The hungry wolf let out a scream and jumped away quickly. Pei stood up, took a look, and found that the hungry wolves were bleeding and leaving one by one. Seeing this, Pei frowned. Wolves, such things are rare. When Pai followed the team outside before, she had never seen this wild wolf. Pai really didn't expect to see this wild wolf. Ouch! Suddenly, a voice came. Hearing this voice, Pai's condensed, and she looked around. Pai's face changed slightly. She was shocked to find that there were grey wolves standing around her. A group of grey wolves came out of the woods and surrounded Pai. Pai also noticed that part of the grey wolf's mouth and nose was stained with blood. The blood did not come from the grey wolf. But at this moment, Pai understood. Those who enter the woods have become meals for these beasts. Hateful. With the thought, Pai summoned the mecha. The mecha that Chen Tao gave to Pai has the function of automatic disassembly. Each part has a small propeller, which can lock on the source of the summons and fly here. But the problem is, Pai never expected that such a thing would happen, so she kept the mecha at home. It will take a while to wait for the mecha to come over. Pai held the short knife in her hand and crouched slightly. She looked at the grey wolves nervously. Most of these grey wolves were as skinny as bones. It was obvious that they had been hungry for a while. They didn't care at all about Pai's demeanor. Ouch! Suddenly, one of the grey wolves raised his head and shouted. The other grey wolves seemed to have received orders and rushed towards Pai crazily. Extremely fast. Pai's face was as pale as paper. She gritted her teeth and fought with a short knife. Although Pai was not weak, she could not defend herself against the attacks of nearly 20 hungry wolves. He stabbed 2 hungry wolves to death in succession. Suddenly, Pai felt the hungry wolf next to her, opening its mouth and biting her thigh. Pai's pupils shrank, she held the hungry wolf in her hand, pulled it away suddenly, and took 2 steps back. Pai glanced at his legs, just once. Pai-san had a strange feeling in his heart. What's going on? Before she could sort out the strange feeling, other hungry wolves pounced on her again. Pai holds the knife in one hand and stabs or cuts when he gets close. But Pai was still bitten. Even her leather jumpsuit, which was made for fighting, was torn apart by the bites of these beasts because of its very tough fabric. At this time, Pai could already feel the strange feeling. Very strange. Although these hungry wolves could tear her clothes apart, their fangs could not penetrate her skin. This scene is very strange. But now Pai no longer cares about why. Facing so many hungry wolves, she can only fight. A full half-hour or so passed. Pai's breathing was a little messy, but those hungry wolves were dead and injured, and now only 5 were left standing, and 2 of them had wounds from knife wounds. The 5 hungry wolves looked at Pai, with a hint of hesitation in their eyes. Pai gritted his teeth and stared at the 5 hungry wolves. Suddenly, one of them lowered his head, turned around and ran away. The other 4 saw it and ran away. Seeing this, Pai breathed a sigh of relief, and she slowly leaned against the tree trunk. She felt a little tired. Shashasha. Suddenly, Pai heard rustling again. When she heard the footsteps, her expression changed slightly and she looked at the source of the sound warily. Pai, came a voice. I saw Enching rushing over with a few soldiers. Seeing Enching, Pai breathed a sigh of relief. Enching ran over quickly, helped Pai, and said, "Are you okay?" Pai's eyebrows stretched slightly, and she said, "It's okay, I can do it by myself, there's no need for this." She took her hand back and didn't need Enching's support. Enching nodded slightly and looked at the corpse of the hungry wolf lying on the ground. Enching's eyes were filled with surprise. Swish, 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 suddenly, a dark mecha flew over from a distance. Seeing those mecha components, Pai's eyebrows stretched slightly. You're late. As soon as Pai had an idea, the mechas were assembled nearby. Enching was slightly startled. She looked at Pai and said, "You killed so many wild wolves without a mecha." Pai looked at Enching, and she nodded slightly, I feel strange too. The teeth of these wild wolves don't seem to be able to bite into my body. And Ching looked at Pei Ai's clothes that had been torn apart by wolves. And Ching looked strange and said, "Your combat uniform is made of the toughest material. You can chew it into something like this. It's impossible that power can't bite into your body." The extremely tough clothes had been torn. How could such a delicate skin like Pei Ai not be able to bite into it? This scene was too much. Pei Ai looked at An Ching and said, I think it's strange too. Please take a look at this. An Ching has always been Pei Ai's captain. In this sanctuary, the person he trusts the most is An Ching. With that said, Pei Ai took off his gloves, rolled up his sleeves, exposed his wrists, and showed them to An Ching. When An Ching saw it, she was stunned. This, An Ching couldn't believe it. She also raised her hand. She looked at the time on her wrist, which was moving little by little, and then looked at the infinity symbol on Pei Ai's wrist. This scene made An Ching a little confused. What is going on? An Ching looked at Pei Ai and said, "What is this?" Pei Ai pulled her sleeves back. She looked at An Ching and said softly, "I don't know why. I think I can only find out by asking him." An Ching looked at Pei Ai. She breathed a sigh of relief and said, "You mean, Chen Tao?" Pei Ai nodded slightly, "Yes, this is what he left for me, although I don't know what it is." And Ching said, "I'm also very interested. Could it be because of your body that hungry wolves can't bite through?" Hearing An Ching's words, Pei Ai thought of Chen Tao, and her heart warmed slightly. Maybe that's true? That would be great if that were the case. That means that man has been trying every means to protect her, which is what she needs most. After all, this is what a soldier should pay most attention to, life. Chen Tao cherishes her life. He is always by Pei Ai's side, protecting her. How can this make Pei Ai afraid to move? The corners of Pei Ai's mouth couldn't help but raise slightly. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 389. Pei Ai looked at the infinity symbol on his wrist, raised his hand and touched it gently. Pei Ai's eyes were filled with luster. This symbol and the body that cannot be hurt by hungry wolves, it seems that these questions can only be asked to him when he comes back, Pei Ai muttered to himself. Other side. The time in Dixingdal district was around 9 o'clock in the morning. A ray of sunlight passed through the window and fell on the bedroom floor. There is a large bed in the bedroom. On the big bed, a petite girl was lying on her side. The girl was wearing a thin shirt and was lying quietly like this. She was very petite. She looks like an exquisite doll. What is different from the doll is that she looks cuter, and her skin is crystal clear, delicate, and smooth. She was sleeping with her eyes closed. Behind the girl is a man. The man gently hugs her and holds her in his arms. The two cuddled up against each other and fell asleep. Perhaps feeling the light outside the window, the girl's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes. Her eyes were the color of rubies, which was a beautiful color. She had just woken up, her eyes looked lazy and confused, and there was a blush on her fair cheeks. She slowly woke up and looked down at the hands that were wrapped around her waist. Betty's face flushed slightly. She raised her hand, held it, and took it away. Betty wanted to get out of Chen Tao's arms. But after such a move, Betty couldn't help but frown cutely. Big bad guy. Betty got out of bed, dragged her weak body and walked out of the bathroom. Not long after Betty left, Chen Tao opened his eyes. He looked at the closed bathroom door and smiled. Chen Tao also stood up and put on his clothes. Chen Tao's ears could hear the sound of water rushing in the bathroom. Betty was probably taking a shower. Chen Tao didn't bother him. After getting dressed, he lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling. He was lost in thought. During this period, Chen Tao enjoyed a long period of comfort. Living a comfortable life day by day, with girls accompanying me, is not so boring. As for the affairs of the universe, they are all handled by Wei Lia now. Wei Lia's leadership skills are extremely outstanding, coupled with the high-concept weapons and armors that Chen Tao left to Wei Lia. Basically, in the last 10,000 years, as long as there is no accident, this universe cannot be destroyed by people from the outer universe. Chen Tao's goal has been achieved. He stood up and slowly sat on the bedside. He raised his hand and a 3D screen appeared in front of him. The screen was full of green data. Data jumps. These data are actually the code of this universe. Through this code, we can easily see what is happening in this universe. Simply put, this is the code of the entire universe. As long as there is this, Chen Tao can know everything and every move in the entire universe. He could see Pei Ai wondering about the infinity symbol on his wrist, and he could also see Demantia sitting in front of the commander's office giving orders to his men. In addition to these, Chen Tao can also see what is happening in other civilizations. Suddenly, a picture attracted Chen Tao's attention. Chen Tao stretched out his hand and pulled out a code inside, while the other codes disappeared. Coded into a picture. Looking at the scene in front of him, Chen Tao had a hint of novelty in his eyes. Through this picture, Chen Tao could see a group of people wrapped only in rough animal skins. It was obvious at a glance that these people were very primitive people. But what's interesting is that these people have a fluffy tail behind them, which looks like a fox's tail, and they also have a pair of fluffy ears on their heads. These ears are like fox ears, fluffy and pointed. They look a lot like Fang Sueking as a phantom, but unlike Fang Sueking, their ears are in the position of human ears. At the same time, the genes they possess are not the genes of the enchanting spirits. They are just people from another civilization on another planet. Their ancestors looked like foxes, but they were not the same species. Due to some miraculous coincidence of evolutionary paths, the fox-like creature evolved hands and feet. Became another advanced intelligence. What Chen Tao saw in front of him were these intelligent entities. Chen Tao is currently the 6th generation genetic body. By reading the genetic codes of these people, he can naturally deduce the situation. However, Chen Tao still felt a little strange looking at these creatures with furry tails and ears. Chen Tao has seen advanced intelligent beings similar to mermaids that evolved from humanoid creatures in the sea, and he has also seen advanced intelligent beings called dragons that evolved from dinosaurs. Chen Tao did not expect that this time he would encounter an intelligent body like this that evolved from fox-like ancestors. Still quite interesting. What are you looking at? A voice suddenly came from beside him, interrupting Chen Tao's thoughts. Chen Tao came back to his senses and looked at the people around him. I saw Betty standing there slim and graceful, wearing a thin shirt, her skin was a little moist, and she could tell that she had just taken a shower. The shirt fit her charming and petite figure and looked quite cute. The hem of her shirt was very short. Looking down, you could see her long, white legs. She was barefoot, stepping on the cool floor, looking very cute. Her long, fiery red hair was also a little wet, but it looked a little more charming and cute. Chen Tao looked at this scene, he smiled and said, "Come." He reached out, took Betty's hand, and pulled Betty into his arms. Betty leaned against Chen Tao's arms, she looked forward, she could see the picture, through the picture. You can see those people with tails and ears. Betty blinked subconsciously, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "Why are you looking at this?" Chen Tao smiled, put his arm around Betty's slender waist, and said, "It just feels very novel. Except for Fang Sueking, I haven't seen a beast with tails and ears." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "I'm more novel than them. I have wings and horns." As she spoke, a pair of small red horns appeared on Betty's forehead. Because Chen Tao was behind him, he did not show his wings. Looking at the pair of small horns on Betty's forehead, Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and subconsciously touched her small horns. It was a little hard, similar to the horns of animals. Well, don't touch it. When Chen Tao touched her horn, Betty cried out softly, slapped Chen Tao's hand with her little hand, and then rolled her eyes at Chen Tao. She crossed her arms and stopped looking at Chen Tao. Looking at Betty's reaction, Chen Tao blinked his eyes and smiled with some novelty. Is it very sensitive here? Betty blushed and said, it's not sensitive, it just feels weird. Chen Tao smiled and said, it's okay, let me touch it more, it won't be weird. I don't want it, you big bad guy, Betty snorted softly. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 390. Although Betty said so, the pair of small horns did not retract. If they did not retract, does it imply? Chen Tao's big hand fell on Betty's horns. Betty blushed, turned slightly to avoid Chen Tao's hand, hid her face in Chen Tao's arms, and said, don't make trouble. Chen Tao smiled and said, it's okay, be good, let me touch it. Betty closed her eyes, but her fair cheeks were flushed. Chen Tao reached out again and touched the pair of many red horns on Betty's forehead. It was a little hard and a little rough, which was completely different from her smooth face. This contrast felt a little special. Okay, Betty puffed up her little face and said, have you touched enough? Betty blushed and looked unhappy. But what's interesting is that she clearly acted unhappy, but she didn't take the initiative to retract her horns. In fact, if she just retracted her horns, Chen Tao would have no choice. But she didn't do it. This scene seems to be in line with the saying the mouth is disgusting but the body is upright. The mouth says no, but the body reacts very honestly. Very cute. Chen Tao approaches Betty, rubs her nose with his nose lovingly, and kisses her cheek. Betty's face is red. Don't make trouble, it's itchy, Lolita control, big pervert. She cursed in her mouth, but the corners of her mouth were slightly raised, and she pursed her thin lips, as if she wanted to hide the joy. Chen Tao smiled and said, so cute. If it weren't for your child, I would really like to spend the whole day with you in bed today. Betty's face turned red, and she symbolically hit Chen Tao's chest with her little fist, Lolita. Chen Tao was happy, and he said with a smile, but you just like me, a Lolita, what should I do? Do you control Lolita? Betty's face turned redder, and she hit Chen Tao's chest with her fist unwillingly. It's obviously your fault, what does it have to do with me? I don't like you because you are a Lolita, really, I'm so unlucky to meet a Lolita like you. Chen Tao leaned down and blocked her complaining mouth at the right time. They separated reluctantly. Betty's eyelashes moved, revealing a touch of ruby eyes with water vapor. Chen Tao gently stroked her cheek and said with a smile, can you do it a little more? Betty hid her face in Chen Tao's arms, bad guy, Lolita control, you only know how to bully people, I will ignore you. She puffed her face, leaned her little head against Chen Tao's chest, and closed her eyes. She really ignored Chen Tao and didn't even look at him. Look at Betty's little reaction. This arrogant Betty really makes people want to ravage her. Chen Tao smelled Betty's hair fragrance, got up a little, hugged Betty, and laid her flat on the bed. Betty was slightly startled. She looked at Chen Tao with a gleam in her eyes, Lolita control. Chen Tao held her little hand, looked at Betty, and said with a smile, yes, I am a Lolita control, and you are a Loli. In this way, if nothing happens, it seems to be unworthy of my name of Lolita control. Betty blushed, but still said, Lolita control, big pervert. Chen Tao looked at Betty with a puffy face, and smiled, can I think this is a provocation? Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and turned her face away from him. Chen Tao slowly lowered his face. Betty closed her eyes. 3 hours later. Chen Tao was wearing a bathrobe, sitting at the head of the bed, with his hands around his chest, looking forward. In front of Chen Tao, a blue frame was floating, and the people in the picture could be seen in it. The people in the picture were the people with furry tails and ears that Chen Tao had just seen. Chen Tao observed their every move. Chen Tao's sight fell on the screen. Interestingly, Chen Tao found that the girls wearing rough animal skins had really good figures. Their waists were slender, and their legs were slender under the animal skins. Their figures were particularly hot. The only drawback was that their skin was dark blue. This was inherited from their ancestors, a skin problem caused by a special gene. Although they were good looking and had good figures, the blue color made Chen Tao a little uncomfortable. So Chen Tao just took a look to see the development and customs of this civilization. But, after a while, Chen Tao's sight was attracted by one of the girls in the group of fox people. The girl was tall and had a hot figure. More importantly, her skin was white. Although it was a little blue, the white was tinged with light blue, which did not affect the beauty at all. Instead, the light blue added a bit of exotic style. She was wearing rough animal skins and a blue-skinned girl. They went into the mountains together, seemingly picking wild vegetables. The two talked and laughed. Suddenly, a voice came. Chen Tao was startled when he heard the voice. He looked to the side. It was Betty who spoke. But Betty closed her eyes and turned over slightly. She had a smile on her face and seemed to be still sleeping. She was sleeping soundly. She looked very cute. Watching this scene, Chen Tao smiled. She was still sleeping and seemed to be exhausted. Chen Tao raised his hand and stroked her hair. He comforted her gently. He continued to look at the scene in front of him. In the picture, Nia, actually, don't worry about it all day long. The girl with dark blue skin smiled at the light blue girl next to her. I think you are already very beautiful, and you have a pretty good figure. Don't pay attention to those annoying people. Guys, they all have no vision. Nia is the beautiful girl that Chen Tao pays attention to. Hearing what her companion said, Nia's ears slowly drooped. She picked wild vegetables and put them into the animal skin bag on her waist without speaking. The dark blue girl looked at Nia. She seemed to notice the change in Nia's mood. She pursed her thin lips and said with a smile, "Okay, let's not talk about this anymore. Nia, look over there." The dark blue girl pointed in a direction. When Nia heard this, she raised her face and looked forward. There is an abyss over there. Looking down, you can see pitch black. Nia looked along the dark blue girl's hand, and she saw blue flowers growing on the wall of the abyss beneath her feet. The flowers were blue and looked like little people, which looked quite beautiful. The dark blue girl smiled and said, "Nia, look, that is the flower of the warrior." She looked at the warrior flower and said expectantly, "I don't know when a warrior will appear and pick this warrior flower and give it to me." Nia looked at the dark blue girl, then looked away and looked at the warrior flower. She smiled and said softly, "Yanni, I think it should be possible." Yanni was startled and said, "Well, I want it too. But, it's so difficult. This is the flower of warriors. Only the real warriors in our tribe can get it." She squatted down, looked at the cliff, and said, "How could such a warrior like us?" When Nia heard this, her eyes glowed with luster and she pursed her thin lips. For Yanni, there may be a chance to get this kind of flower, but in Nia's opinion, she will never have this opportunity in her life.